It's hard to tell. Always thrilled to be joined with M. Carpenter, our legal eagle, senior editor at ordinary-times.com. How are you today, Mel?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. I know one of your pet peeves is always bad legal takes. We have been 2 years into COVID now. Why can't people get their minds wrapped around what Nuremberg codes and what HIPAA is? What's the problem here? Where's the breakdown on all this stuff?
That makes them feel like they're saying something smart, and so many people don't know what those things are or what they actually mean, that other people think that it sounds smart too. So you just end up with kind of a vicious circle of bad takes about Nuremberg and HIPAA, and comparing new vaccines to the terrible experiments and committed on prisoners in concentration camps in World War II. Totally the same thing. And those are probably some of the more atrocious bad takes that we see right now. Anytime you're making a comparison to the Holocaust, it's a bad idea. But I think they just feel like they're really scoring some points there when they bring out the big guns like federal law and international war crimes.
But it sounds so good. Nuremberg protocols, or whatever the terminology is, it sounds big, it sounds important, but it's really nothing like what they say it is anyway, especially when it's applied to something like, vaccines.
Right. It's a set of guidelines or a code for medical experimentation that came about because of these experiments that were done on prisoners in World War II. I mean, it's not a federal, like a United States federal law. You can't go to prison for violating the Nuremberg codes under American law. You can probably be held to account for it in an international court as part of a war crimes trial if it's done during wartime. But no, it's not really a thing that is definitely doesn't have anything to do with vaccines.
And furthermore, there has been a history in this country of vaccines not being good. The government has done some untoward things in our past, so it's not unfair to question those things. But that's not what this is it? That's not honest questioning.
No, it's not. No, this is just chest pounding. This is just exaggeration for effect. This is just try to collect some Twitter follows and get some clout.
Yeah, and speaking of clout, one thing that is completely abused by the pseudo lawyers on social media is free speech. Talk about some of the ways you've just seen free speech absolutely talked ridiculously about online lately.
Well, if I never see the phrase "fire in a crowded theater" again, it would be too soon. I think they've beat that to death with very little understanding of it. Anytime it's a non-government entity, like Twitter kicking you off and people start screaming about free speech, that's frustrating because Twitter's not the government. I know now there's been some argument, even from people who know what they're talking about, that it's such a public square, and being shut out of it is a bad thing, no doubt. But you're not free of consequences from private companies. And another legal take I want to point out here, a bad legal take, is just because it's publicly traded does not mean it's not a private company. I see that quite often too, when people say, but it's publicly traded, it's not a private company. That's not how that works.
Now, and explain that a little bit, because the public there is not who owns the company. It's that's a stakeholder thing. That's a business thing, contract law, torts. That's a totally different thing. Kind of dig into that for a second. Explain it to folks, because they don't understand that the legal term public means a little different than just the mass of people walking back and forth around Walmart.
Right. Public means its own. I don't know about own, but it's a government-run entity. When they talk about public, they're talking about government agencies and even municipal government, not just federal government. That's not a company that is people can buy stock in. I have one share of Twitter stock. I like to say I own Twitter because I have that one share of Twitter stock where I just play around with it. So, but that doesn't mean that I am now the government and I can violate somebody's freedom of speech. First of all, I don't have any control over Twitter. None of the people who own stock have the ability. Well, they may if they run the company, but in general, the public who owns Twitter stock, they don't have the ability to go in and delete tweets and kick people off. So there's no government action happening here on Twitter that we know of.
Yeah, Facebook's trying really hard to do that, but that's a separate situation. Talk about it this way though, because people have an hard time understanding it. Who does own Twitter? Because it's a company, but since everybody uses it, they don't think of it like a house or a business or a physical location or a piece of property, but it's still property. Twitter owns Twitter. Why is that such a hard legal concept for people to get their heads around? Is it because we all use it, so we feel ownership on it? But that's not how the law's written, is it?
No, and I think you're right. It's so ubiquitous. To the people on Twitter, it seems ubiquitous. I know a lot of people who don't have Twitter accounts, and way more people have Facebook accounts that have Twitter accounts. So it seems like it's part of everybody's life, but it isn't. And I think that's just something that happens when you're very online, especially on Twitter, when you're somebody who spends a lot of time on there, like I do, and like I know you do. And it seems like, well, everybody has this. So it's the same as telling people they can't stand in the town square and speak when that's a violation of free speech. No, it's not the same thing. And anybody can open up a Twitter account. It's just that if they can't follow the rules, which as a private company, they are allowed to make their own rules, then they can be kicked off the platform. And it's people get very angry about that, and they feel like they're being kicked out of this big universal experience because it can feel like that sometimes.
But let's run this out to the end game because I think people get wrapped up in the moment of, oh, I'm being censored or this person's being silenced. But you're a lawyer. I'm not. You explain it. What would be the end game if they didn't, if something like a Twitter or a Facebook, as nefarious as Facebook can be, we've seen what they're doing lobbying wise. What would the end game be if they couldn't have control over their own platforms like that and couldn't control it? Because that would be the end of open and free expression. Also, you're kind of killing what you're saying you're proclaiming if you don't have those legal protections for the companies, correct?
Correct. I think you end up, if Twitter gets taken over by, let's say the really vile white supremacists that aren't even veiled in their vitriol. They get on there and they say that the most terrible things, and pretty soon you run all the good people off, and then their business model goes in the garbage. If it gets taken over by people that no one wants to be associated with, you don't want to see them in their timeline, and there's no way to stop it, and you just end up with a cesspool that no one with any sense wants to be a part of, and the next thing you know, Twitter is gone.
All right. Talking to M. Carpenter, senior editor at ordinary-times.com. She's one of our legal experts we love to have on. Her Wednesday writs are always excellent at ordinary-times.com. Make sure you check with that. We're going to ask her more legal questions, more bad legal takes, and we're going to set her up on some food questions too, right after this on Her Tell. Welcome back to Her Tell. We're talking to M. Carpenter, our legal eagle. Something that's been all over the news, especially in your part of the world. Folks want to talk about these vaccine lotteries, and we've talked about them a little bit too. One of the bad legal takes I see on social media all the time is that is coercion, or a company saying that somebody getting a vaccine, that is coercion. But legally speaking, coercion is a very specific legal term, isn't it?
It can be. It depends on where you live, if it's actually defined in your code, your jurisdiction or not. But coercion doesn't mean incentive, and that's what these lotteries are. They're not coercion; they're incentive. Everybody is taking you out of society if you don't. Well, I guess maybe some people want to argue what that means. I say taking you out of society, but coercion is you're going to go to prison or you're going to go to jail if you don't do this. That's perhaps coercive. And again, coercive is not necessarily always a illegal thing. you're going to get a ticket if you speed. That's coercion to drive the speed limit. It's not a bad, it's not, it's not illegal to do that. But these vaccine lotteries are not coercive. They're incentives. I entered every single one of them. I didn't get a darn thing. So, and still I got my vaccine. So can't, you can't say coercive when you have a choice. And if you want to get into whether some places, not where I live, but other places where, you can't go into a restaurant or those types of things, you may start to feel like not being vaccinated, you're being shut out of society, or you don't really have a choice. It's either stay in your house all the time or you have to get a vaccine, that kind of thing. I can understand, there being some argument there about how far we can go with that. But, enter your name in this drawing and you might win a truck. You can't enter your name in the drawing unless you've had a vaccine. That's just incentive, not coercion.
Yeah, and we covered on the show that the guy that won the 80-some thousand dollar customized truck actually was trying to sell it because he's got to pay the taxes on it, but that's another matter for another day.
Yep.
um let's zoom out for a second. 2021 was the year of really big, really loud trials. I don't want to get into the specifics of all these trials. We just had another one with Elizabeth Holmes in the last few days, had that verdict come down on Monday. What's a healthy way for an average person to kind of sift through some of this stuff? Now, you're a lawyer, so you understand the terminology, but it doesn't seem like we cover these big trials, whether it's that or the Rittenhouse or the Aubrey case, or pick whatever big name case you want to talk about. Supreme Court cases, we're going to have a bunch of them come springtime. What's a healthy way for the average person to try to get some good legal information, because they may not know all the ins and the outs of the law, but our news media doesn't do a real good job of explaining these things other than the outrage at whatever the verdict is, either which way. What would you tell people to do?
Well, first of all, I would say that they need to watch, if they're going to watch these trials, they need to try to take a step back and watch with a more disinterested view. Depending on what side you're on, it's easy to villainize the opposite side. If if you were pro prosecution in the Rittenhouse case, it was easy to think that the defense attorneys were re-victimizing the alleged victims, or being unfair, or but that's they're doing their job there. And a lot of what you see, people watch these trials and they don't understand that these things they are seeing that seem unusual or outrageous are not unheard of. I remember, I believe it was the Rittenhouse judge who told a biblical story, some sort of a religious story, and I know people got very worked up about that. But the meaning of the story was relevant to the point that he was making. It was kind of an anecdote. It wasn't necessary. It was more of the judge injecting some color into things. It wasn't a moralizing or, a proselytizing. It was just kind of a historical anecdote that happened to be a biblical story. And those types of things happen all the time in court. Some judges are very colorful and they do like to tell stories and they talk a lot, and that happens. So you have to, I think the best way maybe to get a handle on things is not to watch the legal talking heads on your favorite news station, or to read a BuzzFeed article or something. But maybe if you have any lawyers in your life, talk to them, and you're probably going to be surprised by what you hear. I know that a lot of people in my life were very surprised whenever I told them I agreed with the Rittenhouse verdict, because I don't know if you know this about me, but I skew liberal. And most people who skew liberal were very upset about the verdict and thought that that was a miscarriage of justice. I, on the other hand, agreed with the jury based on what I saw. So I think if you talk to the lawyers in your life, if you're lucky enough to have one of us around you, I think that might be the best way to kind of get some perspective and get a handle on what you're seeing and ask questions. Most lawyers understand that you're not a lawyer and you don't necessarily know why something happens in court. And most of us are more than happy to tell you what we know. We're kind of known for that.
See, I was with you right until the end there when you did the lawyer thing and made it all about you, but that's neither here nor there. One way to follow up on that, though, is people that have never been in a trial or been in a legal action, I don't think they understand what a self-contained ecosystem of trial is, especially a long trial. Like it's
Mhm.
its own life form. You're in it, that it completely consumes you for a couple of weeks or however long the trial goes. Some of these big cases, it could be a month or two, sometimes maybe years in a way. These things are
Mhm.
completely self-encased ecosystems, really, and we get these little glimpses through technology of clips. Like most of the clips of the judge in the Rittenhouse case, people are getting, they don't understand the jury's not in the room for that sort of stuff. These are all aside from,
Right.
like, there's a lot of nuance to these things where a lot of things that come off as outrageous, and I'm not defending anything that judge did, I'm just talking broadly here. People just get bored because they're in that courtroom 8, 9, 10, 11 hours a day after day after day, week after week after week. There's going to be a sides. And then in the kind of the age we live in, that's what comes out on social media, not the, 38 hours of boredom that week. And people kind of draw conclusions from them. And that's not a healthy way to look at these big cases at all, is it?
No, it's not. And that's again when it's being televised and it's being talked about. Those are the moments they're going to pull out. But you're correct. There's so much that happens during a trial that is mind numbing. I personally could not stand listening to jury instructions. Not necessarily the case specific jury instructions, but most judges have a very long soliloquy of sort of general instructions about the jury's role and what they can and can't consider, and a lot of kind of lofty speech. And the judges that I've practiced in front of, I've those get very long-winded in my opinion. It's necessary, it is important, but that's an example of the type of thing that can just be absolutely mind-numbing. It's not as fun like you see on TV when the lawyer jumps up and screams objection and goes on a rant. You don't get to do that. Most of the time you just object and give a basis like objection relevance or objection hearsay. You don't get to say objection, your honor, we're blah, 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 and you keep talking. You're not supposed to do that. If you want to explain your objection, quite often you get called up to the bench and they do it kind of in whispers at the bench out of the where the jury can't hear. And they turn the white noise on the microphone, and you chat up at the bench, and a lot of that doesn't get caught on those microphones when these are televised. So it's interesting to me to watch a televised trial because I think they do a pretty good job of cutting away to the talking heads while the boring stuff is happening, but you miss a lot of the nuance that way.
Yeah. All right. Here's some nuance for you. You are a proud West Virginian. Your Twitter handle is actually West Virginia Esquires. Let people know, because you're talking to a worldwide audience through the magic of the interwebs. What is the proper way to have a pepperoni roll?
Gosh, warm. I like my pepperoni roll warm. I like it with cheese. I prefer sliced pepperoni first. I can do the ground up pepperoni. That's fine. I'll take the stick pepperoni, but it's probably my third favorite. The greasier, the better. It has to be yeast roll, soft dough. Don't give me any of this wrap the pepperoni up in a crescent roll crap. That's not a pepperoni roll. I don't know what that is, but it is not a pepperoni roll. Um, so the best way to have one is just to have one. Come to West Virginia and get a real one. Don't go to some gas station in Ohio and get a pepperoni roll. It doesn't count. Go to Fairmont. That's where I'm from. That's where the pepperoni rolls originated. That's the best place to go. I'm particularly fond of Cala Sestina's pepperoni buns, which is a little different than a pepperoni roll because it's basically more like a hoagie. They cut it. It's not all inside the bun. They cut the bun open and put the sauce and cheese and pepperoni inside it like a sandwich. Country Club Bakery in Fairmont's another great place, and Chico Bakery in Morgantown. Those are my favorites. I'm pretty far away from them, so down here, if I want a good pepperoni roll, I have to make it myself.
Yeah, folks need to add those. If you're those triple D kind of people that have your list going of travel places to go eat, you can add all of those now. I don't like the stick pepperoni because it's too hard to eat once you get into the actual roll, because inevitably what ends up happening is you take a bite and you end up pulling half of it out. So
Agree.
I'm not a stick person. I'm a slice person because I like to have that little bit of layer action going, especially if it's a pepperoni roll with cheese in it. It definitely needs to be layered.
Yes.
And do not use a crescent roll if you're making your own and you just have no other option. You can get the canned sheet pizza dough. That's better than nothing. Just don't do crescent roll dough. That's
Well,
just
actually, in my opinion,
atrocious.
if you're gonna cheat, get frozen dinner roll dough. That come in the balls, the frozen
Yep.
balls of dough.
Yep.
Use those if you're gonna cheat. Better than pizza crust, way better than the crescent roll, and just as simple, in my opinion. But if
Yeah.
you can't make your own dough, that's my next best.
And my grocery store, they actually sell fresh dough balls at the deli counter. So some of your grocery stores, you can check that out. That's an easy way to do it. Grab it, get you some sliced pepperoni, throw it in there. I still prefer my meats from Jackson's Meat Market back home. I always stop at the gas station who sells those directly from them on my way in and out of town every time. But you got to have your good pepperoni is essential. M. Carpenter, senior editor. Her Twitter handle is at West Virginia Esquire. You can see it on the screen. Thank you so much for your time today, ma'am. Really appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.
We'll do it every week with you if you'll let us. We appreciate you.
Thanks. Have a good day.